This island is 3/4 covered in snow year-round, and only the toughest of plants can survive. This script is awful. I wonder who wrote this script. It's terrible. It's like this place was specifically designed to keep humans out. Penguins and seals. I can't do that. I wrote a terrible introduction, but all you gotta know is that this place is just really weird. So South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands is a British overseas territory, and to get you situated, it's about 12,000 kilometers away from London, a little over 9,700 kilometers from Miami, and over 1,300 kilometers from Stanley, the capital of the disputed Falkland Islands. And there's no arable land on the island, pretty much. And the only flora really emerges in the summertime in the form of like really hardy moss and grass. And swaths of the island are just rocky and steep, and it's dominated by glaciers and mountains. And at a height of 2,934 meters, Mount Paget is the UK's tallest mountain. So Captain Cook landed on South Georgia in 1775 during his second voyage, and he claimed the island for the UK and named it after King George III. But the question as to who discovered South Georgia is a little contested, with there being 4 candidates. First, it's possible that English merchant Antonio de la Roche first discovered South Georgia in 1675, and this is based off of a Spanish secondary source from 1690, where it talks about Roche and his crew being blown off course and being anchored for 2 weeks on an island that had snow-capped mountains. But was it South Georgia? Like, could have been. Could have also been like any other island with snow-capped mountains in the South Atlantic. Secondly, in 1756, the Spanish ship Leon was blown off course and decided to land somewhere in the South Atlantic. But the coordinates that were recorded are pretty far from like any land whatsoever. And so the crew named the island Isla San Pedro, which is where the Argentinian name for South Georgia Island comes from. South Georgia Island. Just South Georgia. This is a terrible script that I wrote. It's not like I spent like 5 months on it or anything. Thirdly, and most interestingly to me, there's a really out there theory that Amerigo Vespucci's crew was the first to discover South Georgia, with this happening sometime between 1500 and 1501. According to a letter that he wrote, Vespucci and his crew, quote, sighted new land, traveling along it for some 20 leagues, and found it to be a wild and alien coast. I just felt like I needed to break up the monotony, I'm sorry. But while maybe Vespucci was talking about South Georgia, he could have also been referring to a different island or archipelago in the South Atlantic. We just don't know. Finally, there's Captain James Cook. And of the 4 crews who may have discovered the island first, Cook's is the only one who we have conclusive evidence for actually reaching it. Despite that, Cook credited the Leon and de la Roche's discoveries of some unknown places for inspiring his discoveries. And I'm putting on screen right now the quote where he does that. Cook went home with tales about a land rich in seals, and this in turn led to a large wave of hunters from America, the UK, and Scandinavia coming to South Georgia. In 1786, the island's first sealers left aboard the Lord Hawkesbury, which was filled with pelts. Fur and elephant seal populations would be decimated over the following decades. In the island's history, the largest recorded haul of fur seal pelts was 57,000. James Weddell approximated that sealers took about 1.2 million pelts in 1825 alone. Come the early 1900s, sealing on South Georgia stopped as fur seals were on the brink of extinction, and the industry stopped being profitable as a result. The story of South Georgia really picks up in 1904 when Carl Anton Larsen opened the island's first whaling station at Grytviken. The settlement gets its name from a previous trip Larsen had made to the area in 1902 when he saw tripods that sealers had abandoned. Because of the large whale and seal populations in the area, Grytviken was immensely profitable, and within the next 8 years, others would establish 6 more whaling stations on South Georgia. One of them, Leith Harbor, was the world's largest at one point, with 500 people living there. Larsen was pretty morally conservative. For example, he banned his workers from drinking alcohol, but like you're on like a remote island in like the South Atlantic. So what these workers would do is that they would drink cologne and, quote, squeeze boot polish through bread. Grytviken has a neo-Gothic church that Larsen had built to prevent the whalers from sitting. It was prefabricated abroad, much like many of the other buildings on the island. In 1904, South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, and the Antarctic claim of Graham Land were incorporated into the Falkland Island dependencies. I don't know how monotonous I'm sounding, I'm sorry. I hope I'm not. At first, blubber was the only thing that was extracted from whales, but the British government eventually required that companies process entire carcasses. But before these regulations were put into place, companies would just abandon whale corpses on beaches. But once that practice had stopped, whale meat was used for livestock feed, and whale bone was used for bone meal. The oil from baleen whales was used for pharmaceuticals, chemicals, cosmetics, food, and even explosives. Leaving England in 1914, Shackleton's Endurance expedition was supposed to cross Antarctica, but before his crew could get to land, the mothership Endurance ended up being stuck in the Weddell Sea's ice. The Endurance would eventually sink on October 27th of that year. Shackleton and his men floated on some ice, That's worded really weirdly. Shackleton and his men floated on some ice with some lifeboats. I'm leaving that in. After a while, they arrived at Elephant Island, and from there, the nearest inhabited land was South Georgia, which was 800 miles away. So Shackleton and 5 other men left for the island on the lifeboat James Caird before landing on South Georgia 15 days later. But they had a big problem. They landed on the unmapped, uninhabited side, and so they had to climb more than 900 meters over the mountains, and they walked for 36 hours to get to Stromness. Once they were there, they were able to get help from the men on Elephant Island. In 1922, Shackleton succumbed to a heart attack after boarding another ship to the Antarctic. He's buried in Grytviken today. Within a couple decades of whaling operations beginning on South Georgia, the populations surrounding the island were depleted. This increased the importance of factory ships, which were able to venture into more bountiful waters. But because factory ships led to increased supply, the price of whale oil collapsed, leading to the closure of 2 whaling stations. Because all of the men were drafted for World War II, the whaling stations shut for a few years. Although operations resumed after the war, only 9 of the original whaling stations reopened. Meanwhile, there were 9 factory ships and 93 whale catchers. Towards the end of the whaling industry in South Georgia, people started hunting elephant seals for oil. Regulations helped protect populations somewhat, but eventually, when it comes to the whaling industry, there just weren't many whales left, and so the industry just stopped being profitable. The stations began closing one by one. Grytviken shuttered in 1964, and the following year, the island's last whaling station, Leith Harbor, closed. Although whaling operations on South Georgia ended in 1965, there's still a fishing industry there today. In conclusion, don't slaughter cute animals for profit. And if you're going to make a YouTube video about some obscure islands in the South Atlantic, make sure you do it quickly before you lose interest. Goodbye. And please give me advice in the comments. This is my first time doing something like this. Bye.